And here we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the third Tuesday of the month. Welcome to Raising Multilinguals Live. My name is Tetsu Young from Ask Tetsu.
Yes, and yes, thank you. And my name is Uteli Macharibot from Uti's International Lounge. And today we're very honored to welcome back Nayr Correia Ibrahim at Raising Multilinguals Live, because you were also our guest in 2021 and shared about the tripartite framework of identity, person, place, and experience. But today's topic is learning to read and write en plusieurs langues, mitos et fakten. I love this title. So just a very few things about Nayr Correia Ibrahim. She's Associate Professor of English Subject Pedagogy at Nord University in Norway. And she has been involved in many projects about multilingualism, and I'm sure that she's going to share more about this. So she looks back at more than 25 years of experience in English and bilingual education as teacher, trainer, materials writer, manager, researcher, and much more. So I promise that I keep it short. So thank you very much for being our guest and for diving into this topic that is so important to all of us. So shall we just jump in and ask you the question that we like to ask at the beginning? That's to say, what made you focus on multilingualism in individuals and education in your research and your work?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, thank you, Uta and Tetsu, for inviting me again. I think it's always wonderful to speak to you. And I'd just like to say that I just love the work you do. I think it's so important because you're these champions of multilingualism. And I think we need them. We need them. You don't give up. You just keep going. So it's wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah, so my work with multilingualism, I suppose, started when I was working with bilingual. Well, we used to call it at the bilingual section in Paris, at the British Council in Paris. And so we created a section for children who had both English and French, but then they also had other languages. But the focus was actually developing their literacy skills in English. That's why they came to us. They could speak English. They had either English-speaking parents or one English-speaking parent. They had lived in an English-speaking country, and they came to us to develop their English literacy skills. And then what was interesting about that was finding out how many of these children were actually multilingual. They had English, French, and then they had all these other languages because they'd lived in different places. The parents had different languages, and and they could speak them to different degrees. Some of them also could read and write these languages, and that's where my interest started. And then I did my PhD in identity with how do these children who actually speak 3 or more languages actually, first of all, keep up their languages. What is their interest in their languages? How do they keep up the languages? And these children were also learning to read and write language. They're all 3 languages in 3 different educational contexts. And I just thought it was really interesting to research this group of children who kept up the languages and were very positive about having all these languages in their lives. So I thought that was fascinating. And then I think my own background, I suppose, also being brought up as a multilingual and then bringing my son up to be a multilingual and also in different, in one educational context, but also in sort of a bilingual educational context. So all of those experiences sort of helped me get to where I am today, which is working with teachers in focusing on English language, because that's always been my professional background, is English language teaching, and now teacher education in the English language, but also integrating a multilingual perspective, because societies are acknowledging, not becoming more multilingual. They're finally acknowledging that they are more multilingual, or that they are multilingual. And classrooms, even in a place like Norway, where I work at the moment, are becoming very diverse. Even in small towns, classrooms are quite diverse in terms of the number of languages that children speak at home and that they bring to the school context. So it's important for teachers teachers to understand what's going on with these children and how they are trying to manage their multiple languages in the school context and between the school and the home. So so this is how I suppose I got to where I am today, where working with teachers and including the multilingual perspective.
That's perfect. Thank you very much. Yes, and like you just mentioned, or you mentioned just for a second, as we are hopefully really moving a little bit away from the monolingual standard when talking about multilinguals, especially in education and in research. Can you maybe shortly explain how learning to read and write in multiple languages is different for multilinguals? Yeah, compared to monolingual. Again, we do it, but where should we start, or what is different? Where? Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's a big question because there are so many factors to take into account. I think the important thing to remember is that learning to read and write is about understanding. You know, those little squiggles on a page. What do those squiggles on a page actually mean? When you put those squiggles together, they form a word. And when you put those words together, they form a sentence. And all of this is making some kind of meaning. And the important thing is to understand that these squiggles on a page put together in a certain order actually create meaning. So when children actually finally understand that concept, then they understand the concept of reading. They understand the concept, okay, wait a minute, I can actually put these sounds together or put these letters together, or the squiggles together, and there's meaning. There's also obviously the connection between the squiggles that are written. I'm calling them squiggles because that's what they are for children, I suppose, at the beginning.
That's not the scientific term? Sure.
Yeah. You can call them letters or yeah. But when the children actually also figure out that the words they are saying, the sounds they are using, have a written equivalent. So you've got the phoneme, and there is an equivalent grapheme. So as soon as they figured that out, they start working out words, and they start working out the concept of reading. Now, that doesn't necessarily happen in school. And I think that's also another issue, is that children, depending on their access to the written word, for example, to picture books, to reading at home, to print material in the house, depending on that access, some of them will learn to read and write before they get to school. So you've got these, sometimes you've got these children actually coming into school who can already read and write. So they sort of also destabilizing a little bit the education system that we've put in place, that everything starts at age 6, that doesn't actually happen in that way. And I think with bilingual and multilingual children, that's that's another level of, because they are working out the 2 or 3 different writing systems. And sometimes these children also start that process of learning to read and write quite early on, because they have they're using their metalinguistic knowledge to actually work out the different sounds and the different scripts, etc. So there's so much going on in when children actually start reading and writing in different languages and across different languages. I think we also need to take into account the importance of language mixing, which will inevitably be a part of of not only the spoken language, which we know multilinguals will translanguage. They will mix their languages when they speak, but this also happens at a literacy level, when they write and perhaps when they're reading. So I just have one example. For example, my just anecdotal from my own personal experience. My son was brought up in France, where he actually started schooling in France. Therefore, he started his schooling in the French language, even though he already had English at home. And he also had another language, which was Portuguese, because that's so he had these 3 languages going. And then the word important, he was trying to read the word important in Portugal, but he was using the French sounds to work out the word. So he was saying important, and he goes, important, and then he said it in Portuguese. So can you see how the knowledge of one language was actually helping him understand the other language?
Yes,
so,
absolutely. Yeah, so it starts already when the children have this metalinguistic knowledge of the different languages they are exposed to, even before they start deciphering these scribbles or these signs on the paper, right? So that's so fascinating to see with our children, right? So I think you managed already some of the important aspects, like of multilingualism, that we need to understand to embrace or multiliteracy. Are there any more that you would like to mention?
I think, I think we need to also, what we need to help our children develop, probably, like, for example, phonological awareness is an important element, is an important skill to develop when children are learning to read and write. So when children are aware that the spoken words, for example, can be broken down into units of sound, and I've already mentioned that, but that's a really important element when helping children to read in a language. So those sounds are broken down into units. Then that is actually quite critical in how children learn to read. Now, of course, when you've got different languages coming in, those units of sound will be different, and they have different links to the written word, different spellings, different spelling patterns, different orthographies. And that's, I suppose, where we need to help the children separate the one language from the other. And sometimes children do that themselves. I mean, the example I gave you with my son, he was doing that.
Oh,
did we lose
I think we've lost her for a moment. So yes, we are trying to bridge now the moment.
Okay. Now, if you still hear us, possibly log out and come back in, or even use your phone. That could be. We did have little bits and pieces of skipping, so to speak. So if you do hear us, maybe she is already trying to log back in.
Yes, I think so. So what you were saying, oh, sorry, I left it in the comments. I'm sorry, instead of the private chat. What you were saying was, yes, that our children can learn from the different languages they have, the different orthographies. And I have a question for her when she comes back, and figure out that, for example, yes, in Portuguese, the letters and sounds work in a certain way, in English in another. It's a little bit more complicated. And in other languages the same. So they try to figure out themselves how this works, or actually with the help of teachers, because the teachers usually know what are the important aspects to consider. And to, oh, sorry, I did the same.
Hi, so did I disappear?
Yes, you disappeared. Oh, never mind. We are back, no problem. So you were saying about the children figuring out how the different languages work by deciphering, etc. And I have a question. You were mentioning if then the orthographies are different, or you were mentioning also logographic right? Languages. How is it there? Because there you don't focus on the sounds, you focus on other things. So that is something that I find the most fascinating, but also very difficult for parents then also to decide, should I teach my child to read then, or should I wait until the schools takes care of it? And if the school does not teach my child a given language, what should I do? So that's the next question.
Yeah. I think learning to read and write. Let's start with the basics. Learning to read the language, your heritage language, no matter which language it is, no matter how difficult it is an important process. It's important for the child's background. It's important for the child to understand his heritage. It's important for the child also to have access to a different culture, to a different way of thinking. It's important for the child to have access to different notions. I mean, different languages have different words that describe a particular notion that doesn't exist in another language. I just happen to be in Germany at the moment, and I always love the expression Schadenfreude. I mean, that's Schadenfreude. And it explains something so well that no other language can explain.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, being happy at someone's malheur.
Yes, no, it's not so nice, to be honest.
No, it really isn't.
No,
it's a terrible thing. It's a word that encapsulates that feeling so well. No other language has that word. I mean, we could go on and look at all different languages that does that. I'm living in Norway at the moment, and I discovered a term called friluftsliv, which is living outdoors, living in the outdoors. Such an important element and such an important characteristic of living in Norway and being Norwegian. So all those concepts are important. Now, you can have those concepts at an oral level. However, when you go into the written language, you have access to deeper thinking. You have access to the thinkers of that particular language, the writers, the philosophers. And through the written word, you can get into a much deeper understanding of a culture. It also gives you that independence, for example, at a later stage when you're perhaps a teenager or an adult, to pick and choose the books that you might want to read from in that language. So I think it's a really important process for children to go through. Now, is it difficult? Yes, it isn't easy. Should parents not help children or not give children the possibility of learning to read and write their heritage language because perhaps it's different, it's got a different script, it's a difficult language? And of course, when I say difficult, and I put it in inverted commas, that depends on where you come from. That depends on what your own particular language, for example. I mean, people say that German is difficult. Well, I don't find German difficult, but then I was born in South Africa. I have Afrikaans, so perhaps I've got already an opening into that language that perhaps other people don't. So it depends on where you stand. So not all languages are difficult, depending on what languages you know, which languages you speak. So saying that the language is difficult, yeah. However, not giving the child the opportunity to actually develop literacy in the language, that is unfortunate for the child. And very often what children do when they grow up and when they become adults is they turn around to their parents and say, why didn't you teach me? Why didn't you teach me to read and write this language?
Absolutely.
So I think it's so important for parents to do that. Don't be afraid of how difficult it's going to be. Don't be afraid of what the teachers in schools might say, or what your entourage might say. So, oh, no, don't bother, it's too difficult. Maybe a particular language might not have the same status in a particular context, and that is also unfortunate. Therefore, that language is very often not, or the message that the children and the parents get from the community is that, no, that language isn't good enough. I mean, really, you shouldn't bother with that language. You know, you should learn the language of schooling. That never happens with English, of course, because everybody wants to learn English. English has a very high status. That could happen with Arabic, though. It might happen with Sri Lankan. It might happen with other smaller languages, depending on the community you're living in. But parents, what I would like to encourage the parents is to not give in to that pressure, and to help the children, not necessarily teach the children to read and write. I think we also need to differentiate between parents are parents, they're not teachers.
Yes.
They're not language teachers, they are parents. What the parents need to do is encourage the children to connect with the language, but in a positive manner. If I actually found, if parents try to teach the children how to read and write in that particular language, the children have a kind of a, nope, you're not my teacher, you're my parent, so I'm not going to do this with you.
Yes.
But there are other ways that you can actually encourage children to engage with the language. And the one, I would say, fundamental factor is the positivity parents display when they're talking about their own culture, their own language, how proud they are about their culture and their language, and how they bring that into the family unit and into how the family engages with that particular language and that particular culture, because language and culture are connected. And very often, if a culture is sort of ostracized or in a positive manner in a particular context, and that prevents children from taking the language learning or acquisition further.
Yes.
So parents do play an important role, but in creating the positive environment around that language.
And I suppose also the positive environment that goes also outside the sphere of the family, also within the school. And we have a comment by Margit Tera. Hello, Margit. She's a teacher at an international school near Amsterdam, actually a language-friendly school. If those who follow us know what it is, a language-friendly school that is welcoming all kinds of languages in the curriculum as well. So her question is, what could we tell a concerned parent and a teacher of a 6-year-old multilingual student? The student has started reading in 2 languages, but hasn't gotten maybe where he or she was supposed to be. And here I imagine one of the situations that we observe very often as parents, right? You can transfer the skills that the children have learned at school also to the home language, not only with regards to knowing the colors or the shapes when we start, right? But also later with the reading of the literacy skills. What would you suggest here as a tip, as an answer?
So, so is a child, sorry, this is just, so the child is learning 2 languages at the same time in the educational context? That's my question.
Probably, or yeah, I hope that she is going to add something more. Margit, please add more details if you can.
Yeah. Because if it's in an educational context, if it's in an educational context, usually there is the school will have a system in place to actually teach or to develop literacy in 2 languages. Sometimes they start with 1 language and start the second language, perhaps in the 2nd year or the 3rd year, or perhaps. So that's a different situation. If it's a situation where there's a home language and there's a school language, or so the school language and the non-school language, if you want, then first of all, inevitably there's going to be mixing. And that's the other thing I wanted to bring in, is that the fact that whenever you're dealing with language, there's always going to be mixing, translanguaging, because what we have in our brain are codes and patterns. And language is a code, music is a code, maths is a code. So our brain already functions with codes. It knows how to deal with codes. And then it also bases its new knowledge on acquired knowledge. So if I've got a language that I've already learned, then it's going to look at, okay, wait a minute, this is a language. How can I, is it similar? Is it not similar? Can I use the languages that I already know to develop the new language? So it's not, you're not starting from scratch. And that's, I'm going a little bit of a tangent here, but when you actually learn to read and write, you're not starting from scratch, because the knowledge of a language, any knowledge that you have of another language is already supporting the development of a second language. And that brings me, and that's obviously, if we know the work of Jim Cummings and his interdependence hypotheses, where the knowledge of one language will inevitably impact on the development of a second language. So, but the development of a second language will also impact on your first language. So it is actually a cross-cultural, a cross-linguistic exchange. So, and that happens both at an oral level, and it will happen at a written level. So that's going to happen. So I think in reply to that question is, don't worry about the language mixing. It is going to happen, you know, so that we shouldn't panic about that. What we should do is actually help the children understand or talk through the differences, talk through this mixing with the child. For example, I had a child who once was writing and wrote that I am trilingual. Okay, so lingual using that English spelling pattern LE. So you know the way we say bangle and spangle, whatever, trilingual. What this child heard was, so we're talking about trilingual. So for some reason, the child heard trilingual. Had never seen the written word trilingual, and decided to hypothesize about which spelling pattern she was going to use. Now she did exactly the right thing. She heard trilingual, then it's going to be ingle. There's nothing wrong with that. On the contrary, what I'd like to emphasize is how important that process is and how sophisticated that process is, and that children are capable of doing that is absolutely amazing. So I think what we need to do, both parents and teachers, instead of going, that's wrong, it isn't wrong. It is a fascinating metalinguistic conversation that we can have with the children, and that really helps the learning process. So the conversation with this child would be, that's interesting, you've written trilingual. What do you hear? Do you hear trilingual or do you hear trilingual? So is it the same sound? Is it not the same sound? How would we write a trilingual compared to trilingual? You know, and then you can have discussions. The children can sometimes very often get there themselves when you ask these questions and you try and lead them there. Now, so that's inevitably going to happen, this language mixing. But it's what I'm encouraging is what I'd like to encourage is the parents to have this conversation instead of panicking, is to have the conversation.
Yes, and also the conversation with the teacher, right? So in this particular example that Margit mentioned, the children are using or are taught English at school, so reading English at school, and they are learning Dutch at home and in the community. Now, we have mentioned that in another interview, there are languages. English is one of the more opaque languages, so it's very difficult to learn how to read in English. It takes longer than, for example, Dutch. Dutch is more, grapheme and sound grapheme equivalence is much closer. It's easier to decipher, to decode, so to say. So, but I think what you mentioned now, which I would give back also to Margit, is this collaboration between the parents or those who are teaching Dutch to read Dutch at home or in the community, and the teachers, so that they know what is going on. Because I had this also with one of my daughters when she was learning to read German at home, and the teacher was saying she's making strange mistakes in writing and also reading. She's just decoding in a very strange way. There's something going on. I said, no, actually, she was trying to figure out how these different language patterns work and how to make sense of them, and in the most economic way, right? So how many things can I actually use in both languages without having to separate them? So we put them all together, see what comes out. And it was highly interesting, I must say, for me to see and also to share with the teachers. And we were very lucky to have a teacher that was very passionate about languages anyway. But I think this question of Margit also leads to another question that many parents ask us, and I'm sure that you've heard it thousands of times. Which language should we start with our children? So we want to raise a child with multiple languages. Just think about Tetsu, who is raising his children with Chinese, Japanese, correct me if I'm wrong, please, French, a little bit of English and Spanish. So that okay, I got them all.
Bingo.
My children have also 5 languages, but there is no Chinese, or let's say it was added afterwards. But just a question: which language would you suggest the children should start with? The more complicated one, and then every additional language that is added and is on the left-hand side of the continuum, so more transparent is easier, or what would you say?
I think that depends on the context. I think it's very. I'm not. The children sometimes themselves start learning to read and write themselves. They are in a language. It's not even. It doesn't always depend on us. I remember working with a trilingual who when he got to school in France at the age of 3. So he had 3 languages: so French, English, and Russian. And there was German. 4 languages. When he was about 6, and he was going into the school system in the French system, he already could read English and Russian. So in this case, it was actually quite funny because the mother decided not to tell the school that the child already could read and write, because she knew that it was going to be problematic. And then when the teacher found out, then the parent explained. Now, this is not necessarily the best option. I think the dialogue with the teacher is important. However, in this particular case, the child already brought literacy knowledge to the grade 1 class. So it wasn't like he needed to go through the whole thing all over again. So there isn't really. So here, this child had Russian and English, 2 very different languages, before he actually learned to read and write in French. So sometimes it depends on the context and not necessarily on the language. Sometimes it depends on the child. Perhaps the child has a preference for one particular language. So why don't you start with a language that the child perhaps feels more comfortable in, and then integrate the other one? Because if you decide, okay, let's start with the more difficult one, and the child is happy with that, finds it interesting, perhaps, through picture books, through songs, through chants, and the child engages with the process, absolutely fine. I really don't think there is a fast and a very clear answer to this question: which language should we teach first? It really depends on the context, and it depends on the child. If we may want to start the whole literacy process even before the children start school, but the children aren't ready for that, there I would not advise you start anything in that particular case. And then the question is sometimes also, should we be teaching children to read and write at the same time in 2 different languages? Once again, it depends on the context. Yes, I mean, the human brain can handle the learning of 2 languages and developing literacy in 2 languages at the same time. The issue is very often the school system that has certain milestones that we're supposed to reach at a particular time, and then the child needs to have a certain level in the school language, because through the school language we also develop our academic skills and academic reading skills, which very often the child will not develop in the home language. So it's a very difficult question to answer, because I don't think there is a ready answer. Oh, do that first. It really does depend on the context, the family, the child, how ready the child is to engage with a particular language, and then it depends on how much print you have in the your in the home,
Yes.
and therefore how much the children are exposed to literacy in the different languages.
Yes.
I think the important thing is how the adults in the child's life actually engage with all of this. Because if it's a panic and a panic, and oh my God, now they're going to read 2 or 3 languages, or how are we going to do this? The child gets that, the child will feel that, and eventually say, oh, maybe I shouldn't be doing this. Yet if it's taken quite right, we're going to do it. It's going to be perhaps a long process. We will talk about the mixing of languages. We will talk about the mixing of spellings, of grammatical structure, and take it easy and have this conversation with the teacher in the school.
Yes.
Those are the recommendations.
Yes, absolutely.
As opposed to which language to teach first or second, etc.
Yes, absolutely. I understand. And I myself, I learned to read in German and French at the same time. So really from day one, and it didn't confuse me. I'm not strange. And other languages were added afterwards, and no one was questioning it. And it worked fine. I mean, they're very different in the decoding. But we have a question from Marie Delaney. In your example, Nayr, were the parents English and Russian speakers living in France? I'm wondering about identity and psychological factors. Yes, thank you very much for the question.
Yes, they were. It was an English-German, actually there's German involved, so an English-German bilingual mum who also spoke Russian, a Russian-speaking Ukrainian, living in France. So there were all these languages going, and the children were absolutely well adapted to this interesting multilingual, multicultural context. When they went into the French school, they already had all the one of the children was 7, the other one was 3. So the 7-year-old was already reading and had already learned to read and develop academic language in an English school in the UK, if I'm not mistaken. It was a 3-year-old. He actually started learning to read and write on his own, or at least to start learning to read on his own. Now, in terms of identity and psychological factors, I didn't notice these children were actually in my research, and they were absolutely fine. They were able to talk about learning to read and write. They were having metalinguistic discussions with me. The little one, the younger child, was 3, and when we did the interviewing, he was already 7, and his older brother was 12. But when I interviewed the younger boy, a 7-year-old, is having a metalinguistic discussion with me about how Russian is an easy language to learn, and I'm going, okay, not for me. Why is it easy? He's literally telling me he's using the language of a child. Because an E is an E and an I is an I, it's not all different kind of sounds. I'm thinking, oh my God, you're actually telling me that Russian is a transparent language as opposed to English.
Yes. Yes.
This 7-year-old, because he had been, he had access to literacy in his language, he was able to tell me this in a child's language.
And that's amazing.
So can you see how children are? That's amazing, and that's so sophisticated. It's a sophisticated discussion the 7-year-old was having with me. Now, and he was totally, absolutely fine with being Russian, with having English at home, and then learning French in the school system. They were also very adept at negotiating their identity position, depending on the context. And the older brother told me of a situation where he was speaking English with his mum in the metro, and then apparently someone in the metro said, oh, how lucky you are, you speak English with your mum, etc. And the child says, but I also speak French. I'm also French. It was really interesting. Even though French was not a heritage language, the fact that he was living in France, that he had a very good level of French, gave him a certain French identity through the language. So I think children can negotiate these identity positions as well as adults. So they were absolutely fine, and they were really good students in terms of both French and English. They were learning Russian in a Saturday school, and when they were talking to me about these experiences, they were fine. But the connection was important, because the connection of Russian to the grandparents in Ukraine, the connection of German to the mother's German family, all of that. They thought about that, and they were absolutely fine.
Yes, and this leads to a question that we have again from Margit, that is actually a bit questioning this, or questioning the way that sometimes it's done at school. So her question is, should we be learning to read in a language that we don't speak yet? So new to English, like English as additional language, children at school. Would drilling English phonics have benefits when they don't understand the words, when they don't make the connection, right? The compelling input, etc., that we were talking about in other contexts. Tetsu is smiling.
Yeah.
You read my mind.
Yes.
Reading is obviously two things. You need to work out it's a decoding system. It's a decode. You need to decode the message. You need to decode you've got to crack the code. Yes. that is encapsulated in that language. But that's not enough. Reading is also about entering a different world, and that's why stories and picture books are so important. Entering the world of fantasy for children, entering a world, or entering the story world. If the child doesn't have that connection to the book, they won't read. If a child doesn't understand what's going on, doesn't understand the story, simply decoding the language is not enough. But of course, decoding the language, that writing is important, because otherwise a child isn't going to access the story. So learning in a language that you can't speak is not really, or you don't understand, it doesn't really help. It's not going to help. That's why in the school system, they need those bridges, and the bridge to a new language can be multiple languages. It can be your own language, and that's why it's really important to allow the child's language or languages in the learning process, because through the children's languages, that's how the children are thinking. That's how the children can access concepts through their language. They can access the other language. And remember something, learning to read, and we talk about learning to read and write in multiple languages, but actually it's not really quite the right term, because we learn to read and write once.
Exactly.
We learn to read and write once. It can be in any language. The other languages that we add to our language repertoire, we are just learning the mechanics of that particular language, or the specificities of that particular language.
So what you're saying, I like this image, and I would like to emphasize it, that we learn to read once. So we learn the tools of reading, of decoding once, and then we get to know the tools of every single language that might be different colors, different shapes, but then we make sense of them and we learn how to use them, right? And then we can decode that language as well. I find that very, very important at this point, and I really like this idea. And I would like also to share a question from Miley Lingue. Thank you for following us again. My kids will have many hours at school, and when they go back home, they will be tired, and it's hard to teach them more. Do you have any ideas how to find time to teach them? So you were saying before, and if you agree, I would just skip a few questions that I had prepared and go right to the picture books that you just mentioned before. Would you agree with that? That we talk about that? Okay. Yeah. So yes, can we focus on the pleasure of reading? Yes. So.
Absolutely. I think the word teach here is probably going to put the children off, because I agree, they are tired. They've had a long day at school. And sometimes, I don't know what the context is, but when you're working between languages, it can be tiring sometimes working between languages. And they come home and they probably just want to sit in front of the television or play their games or just switch off from school. And the home has got to be a place where they can switch off from school. However, it doesn't mean that you can't bring in your language through the pleasure of reading. And if we can do that, bring in picture books, find chants, find songs, find poems in the different languages. And then it's not about teaching, it's about reading with the child. It's about that pleasure of reading with the child and reading for the child. The reading aloud is really important. So whether it's a picture book with pictures, the picture book allows you also to have a conversation about what's happening in the story, how the story is evolving. So it's not just about reading, it's it's engaging and interacting with the book as well. It could also be just reading a whole novel aloud with your child. And just another personal experience, my son and I read Harry Potter aloud. I think I read Harry Potter to my son until the last book. And in the last book, we thought, okay, we'll just watch the film. We'll read it later. It was such a pleasure for him to have mom read out the story. And I was reading, and I was absolutely enjoying it. Now, we're talking about a young, 12-year-old. So I was reading these books aloud to him till he was around 12, simply because I could see he was loving it. And I continued. And then that also was a kind of a bridge to him starting, his reading journey. And he started picking books himself. But that process, and for him, I don't think it was necessarily only Harry Potter, the story. It was also that moment with mum or with dad, just before we go to bed, and there's that moment, and that is so important. And when you create those memories of mum reading that story with you before you go to bed, then that's what the child remembers. And when I work with my teachers, I always ask when we start working on the picture book module that I do with my teachers, I ask them, okay, to bring a picture book that their favorite picture book from when they were young, and it's always a picture book, well, always, but practically always a picture book that they remember they read with their parents or that the parents read to them.
Yes.
So if you create that connection, that effective connection to a reading, then it's a lot easier to encourage children to actually do their own reading. And then from a reading perspective, that's also the pointing. When you use your pointer, you can actually use your fingers to point to the languages, to the words as you read. So you're not actually teaching the child, but you are highlighting the words that you read. So the dog said woof, and you've pointed to the words, and the child can see the dog said. So there's so much that can be happening just by spending 10 minutes, 15 minutes reading a book with a child and interacting with the book. That's the beginning of literacy. You can start that with babies if you want. I mean, we've seen how babies also enjoy looking at books. You can do that with 12-year-olds.
Yes, and I think Miley is also going through transition, so they are moving to a new place. And what you just mentioned, making these memories, but also having these routines of making memories is something that really helps children also go through transition a bit in a more healthy way. So it's a bit reassuring knowing, okay, now it's time to read, or it's time to just snuggle and talk about or point at things in the picture book. And what you just said with the picture book, because I find your work about picture books, and I know that you are working with other experts in this domain, and you're very adamant about that, which I really like, because I discovered picture books, or the value of picture books, also thanks to you and your colleagues, because I always said, well, but picture books is not something for someone who is 12, 13 years old. But no, actually not. I discovered brilliant picture books that portray the culture okay, or details that maybe I cannot find in the landscape that is around us, because I'm in the Netherlands, it's very Dutch. So if I take a picture book or whatever book with pictures, yes, doesn't need to be a picture book per se, of the culture, I can teach my child these words, these contexts, or open them the world, right? So would you also say you can read these picture books with all children from 0 to, if you want, 18, 99, I don't know. They're not children anymore.
I'm constantly buying picture books and reading picture books, and I'm an adult. But then I'm also a teacher who works with picture books. So I suppose that helps. But yes, I think picture books are much more complex than just pictures.
Yes.
The interaction with the pictures and the words, the meanings that sometimes don't match what you see in the picture, doesn't match what doesn't match what the words. And these are absolutely wonderful opportunities to start discussing the story. Say, oh, is this happening? What do you see in the picture? Oh, what do you think is going to happen? And also predicting the story. And that's also the pleasure of turning the page. So you're on one page and you're having a discussion about what might happen next, and the child is thinking, oh, maybe he's going to do this. You turn the page and you discover, oh, look what they did. So that pleasure of it, so it's also kind of a surprise, what might happen next. That's also really important in the discussion, in that potential discussion that you can have with the child about a picture book. And some picture books are very sophisticated. The stories behind the picture books are very sophisticated. They're not necessarily appropriate for 6-year-olds, because we always imagine picture books being for the preschool and just about 6-7-year-olds, but they're not. Their stories are quite sophisticated that 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds can engage with. And through that, you can also start discussions around comparing cultures, or critical discussions around the theme of the story, which could also be related to global issues like climate change, like sustainability issues. So there's so much of that these artifacts can actually bring to the class, to not just helping with developing literacy, but also helping to develop discussions around important issues at all ages.
Yes, absolutely. I would like to, I know I'm very conscious about the time that is just passing by. We were talking about mainly now about speaking, developing vocabulary in different languages, and also reading, but we didn't talk much about writing yet. You mentioned it several times, and there is a question from Miley, who thanks you for your answer about the reading books. How about writing? So how to let them practice writing correctly? I must say, I know a little bit of the context of Miley. She has also French as one of the languages, and we know that in some cultures, in some, the writing is very important, and it's the main aspect sometimes of the lessons at school. So there's la dictée, il dettato, diktat. So what would you suggest here about writing?
Well, I think we've got the same. Okay, here we've got children encoding, haven't we? So we've got to now. So we've got this message, and now we've got to actually put this message on a page using knowledge, the conventions of writing. Writing is not an easy process, whether it's in your mother tongue in one language or in multiple languages, because you've got to know the rules. You've got to know the rules of how to, of the spelling rules, the grammatical rules, the sentence structure rules, semantics, syntax, the whole thing. And that takes time. Spelling, for example, as you said, understanding how to spell words in English, it takes a very long time. I mean, children in English schools in all the way to Key Stage 3 still have spelling lessons. And that's not the case, for example, in other countries where spelling rules, you get that out the way by the time you're in primary school. So it depends on the language. Writing, the more exposure you have to the written word through reading, the more that's going to help you. I'm not going to say it's going to make writing easier, but the more that will help you with the writing process. The understanding the spelling patterns and grammatical rules also helps. But when you're actually working with a non-academic language, because once again, we've separated the academic language of the children are learning at school, and the teachers sort of taking care of that. But the non-academic language is helping the children slowly get into that process. So wanting them to start writing full sentences right away may not be the best option, but you can start with visuals. Okay, so let's draw some fruit. Okay, now let's write the fruit. How do you write this in this particular language? So starting small, starting with visuals, and then slowly building into from word level to sentence level to text level. And that's how we used to work with the children in Paris. We used to basically start, okay, what at word level, sentence level, and text level. So word level is easier to manage. Then when you go into sentence level, then you also need to take into account. So word level, you need to take into account different spelling patterns. Sentence level, you need to take into account grammatical structure. Sometimes children are quite capable of identifying patterns. So what really helps, and what we used to do once again in Paris, is to help children identify patterns. So if you write a couple, and picture books are very helpful in that respect, because picture books very often have a kind of repetitive pattern that goes through the picture book. I'm just thinking of a particular book by Eric Carle. And he's got some wonderful picture books like brown bear, what do you see? I see a red bird looking at me. So first of all, you've got that pattern. What do you see is a question. You've got to structure that. What do you see? I see you've got your subject, verb, object. So going through that, and then you can get the children. It's like, once again, let's play a game. Okay, now let's carry on. So the picture book has about 7, 8 animals. Okay, and then let's use animals now from the context you're living in. For example, if I'm living in Norway, I'm saying, oh, let's say reindeer, what do you see? And then the children can learn to write reindeer, or what is it, moose? That doesn't really help. Moose, what do you see? So that kind of thing. So bring in those little elements, play with the children, and then the child, okay, let's write a reindeer. So let's continue doing the story. So the children write reindeer, what do you see? And then the children are slowly practicing the writing. And then you can also identify, once again, patterns. What do you see? What do you see? Talk about, I don't know, WH, what, where, when. I'm thinking of English here. I'm using English as an example. You can do the same with different languages. So then you can help children identify those patterns. But you're not, this is helping children to practice, to start writing, to do writing in a fun, engaging manner in the non-academic language.
Would you agree kind of with I guess Krashen's idea that basically just do massive input, just read and read and read, and you just sort of absorb and understand the grammar and improve your vocabulary, and suddenly it integrates into your DNA kind of. That's in a nutshell.
Yeah. I think, yes, he talks about compelling, he talks about input, comprehensible input, compelling, comprehensible input is really important.
And rather than go into skills where you talk about the grammar or you talk about the syntax, he just says, just read and read.
I think from a pedagogical perspective, I think noticing strategies are very important. So just sort of, okay, yes, give them lots of reading, but, we sometimes working with languages where children they don't have full proficiency in these languages. They may have 3 languages. They may have full proficiency in one particular language and perhaps less in the other, because that's not a language that they're learning at school, or it may not be a language that is used very often at home, because maybe one of the parents don't always speak that language with the child. So it depends on how much the child understands the language, or how much knowledge the child has of that particular language. But I think when you're actually working with writing, I don't think just reading is enough. The experience I have with children in the classroom, reading alone is extremely important, but reading alone doesn't actually help you write. You also need to write. You need to practice writing. The children need that process of, of writing the words, reindeer, reindeer, what do you see? That helps retain, it helps memory as well. So, yes, of course. I mean, I've just been talking about picture books and reading. That's so important. But in terms of the writing itself, they need to practice the actual.
And for practice, the repetition is key. And but I think the link that Tetsu was doing is, okay, let's practice, but something that is compelling, not I don't know, I can 100 times, and then you say I can't anymore. So I mean, it doesn't make sense, right? So having something, if you like reindeers, just repeat it 1,000 times in different contexts. Yes, the red reindeer, the blue reindeer, or whatever. So in that kind of sense, if I understand you right, Tetsu, you wanted to make the link to the compelling and the comprehensive input.
Yeah, well, I think Nayr was putting in bits and pieces of the compelling without actually saying the word compelling.
No, yes,
right?
I know.
So,
yes, absolutely.
We have input, but there's also output.
There is also. My question was really just sort of validate your thoughts on what Krashen means by you are unconscious of the learning itself when you just do lots of reading. You just sort of know the rules suddenly without ever really actively, going the route of the learning the grammar or the syntax or the spelling and whatnot.
Yes.
Yeah.
I always advocate for a balanced approach. I mean, I don't think you should just do one way, 100%. You should always and a customized approach depending on the recipient, right, the child. So
yes, no, I totally agree. I think loads of input is important, but it's just I mean, just the reading alone is not enough. That's why when I'm saying, when I talk about picture books and how when you engage and interact with a picture book and you create those discussions around the story and the predicting of the story, that is important, because that's not just the child sitting there reading or listening to you. The child is interacting with the book. So the child is interacting with the language, is interacting with the ideas, is probably looking at the words that you're pointing to. All of that is important. And then if you get, for example, if you do have an opportunity of getting the child to continue the story and they do their own writing, then they're practicing. That is important. So it's input and output, and it's how you actually create the conditions for output to be possible as well as input.
Absolutely. And I would like to share something that I learned from my children, because they were, at least my son was very fast in learning to read and to decode English very fast at school. And the teachers were impressed. I was impressed. I said, wow, that's going very fast. But I went in very, very often to do the joint reading with a group of children. And then I realized that actually he was very good at decoding, but the comprehension of the text was not always there. So when I asked questions, what do they mean with that? When there was an action word and they didn't exactly know what it was about because there were no pictures. So I know that I had a discussion with one of the teachers that a picture would help here, because that for someone who reads the word the first time can decode it, but misses the context, misses the understanding because of lack of these to anchor the words in the world or in a picture or in a context, in a broader context, is something that sometimes get missed. And I see this in many parents that say, oh, my child is perfect in reading the things. And I said, how much do they actually understand? So that is something where I often then was flabbergasted that my son would read pages over pages in the right intonation and everything. And then when we try to dive into the deep, and I asked him, for example, to repeat that maybe in German or whatever language he chose, I saw where the limits were. So where he needed more words. And I think this is also something that not all the teachers are always aware of. And this is also something where we parents need to tell the teachers, my child is good at reading, yes, but you know, if you ask him now to write down 2-3 sentences about this story, he might not have grasped the gist of it.
Yeah, no, that's a very important point, because sometimes children, they can be very analytical. They can analyze the structure of words. They can put them together. They understand how to do it, but they don't understand the meaning behind. And that's not a good sign, because eventually those children won't read, because they're not going to spend. They're not going to decode like a big thick book like Harry Potter or whatever, and they're not going to sit through that if they don't understand the story. So those are two. So we need to always ensure that what the children are reading, they are understanding, and that scaffolding, that support in terms of the discussions. And if parents can just find that moment in the day to have that discussion, that's so important, because they can probably do that more than a teacher in the classroom where they've got 25 children to deal with. The parent, that one-on-one is so important. And that's the focus on not just decoding, but also on the meaning of the story. And then you create readers, because they get into the story and they love the story.
Yes, absolutely. No, he's an avid reader and very good writer, so I'm very happy with how it turned out. But it was just a moment where, as a parent, when you send your child to school in an additional language and you don't know how all the other languages are going to survive somehow, you see that he's excelling, is very good. But in the end, all the background, or let's say the different layers that are underneath being able to decode, are much more complex and need really these interactions that they have with us, and the discussions and talking about the stories or talking about what is going on, etc. So thank you very much. I'm very aware that we have passed the time. Tetsu is going to
we're gonna have to be the bad guy again. But as usual, what happens is, we sort of pick up speed, halfway through the interview, and then it gets more and more compelling, more and more interesting, and more, and we got all these questions and comments coming in from our audience. It gets more and more interactive, and we just can't let it go. It's such an addictive thing to talk about such an important topic. But there's an end to all good things. But thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nayr, for coming again. So it's your second time.
Yes, thank you.
We'll have more opportunities, hopefully, to get more of your insights on this topic. All right.
I want to thank you again for inviting me. I always enjoyed these discussions, and it's true, we could just go on forever, actually, couldn't we? So
we wish it could just go on and on. But okay, so thank you to everybody who has joined us on Facebook and Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Thank you so much. We've got
thank you from Wiley.
Folks putting in some comments for us.
Yes.
Thanks.
Marine Delaney.
Lots of food for thought.
And Margitera. Obrigada. Oh, Margit, you over
prazer.
And Achim Traut, thank you. And yes, Maria Luz, da Luz Moreira. Thank you very much for following. Yes, thank you.
All right.
Thank you,
everybody. Thank you for your interactions and questions, and we will see you again next week for a little discussion between you, Uta, and myself. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. See you guys. Bye-bye.
Merci beaucoup.